Before I begin even talking about the subject that I'm making this video about, let me just make something clear from the get-go. I'm not advocating any political point of view. I'm not putting forth any suggestions as to how the laws should be changed. And I'm not trying to say anything having anything to do with any human right at all. No restrictions, no nothing. Just so we have that clear. In my honest opinion, one of the great fallacies of our time that's very popular in certain quarters is the idea that human freedom is somehow guaranteed by the private possession of firearms or weapons in general. A well-ordered militia being indispensable for a free society or something like that, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, or I'm not sure the exact phrasing of the Second Amendment, but that's usually what's pointed to, even by non-Americans, to buttress their point of view that freedom is ultimately guaranteed by an armed private citizenry. Well, I wonder if the historical record actually justifies that point of view. I don't believe that it does. The United States, for example, if you actually look at the fighting that resulted in American independence from the British in the late 18th century, the war was actually won by a disciplined army, the Continental Army, that was as absolutist, as harshly disciplined as the most repressive government in Europe. It was generally led by, or trained at least, by Prussian or French officers, both of them absolute monarchies, whose military traditions were certainly not democratic, at least until the French Revolution, and in Prussia much later than that. And another interesting fallacy or interesting stereotype or interesting legend is the idea that it was the Minutemen, the armed guerrilla fighter, that actually defeated the British. Well, that's not true either. Or it wasn't, I'm sure they were definitely involved, but they were by no means decisive, at least not to the extent that one sees in Hollywood movies like The Patriot or The Last of the Mohicans. The British had their guerrilla fighters as well. They had Butler's Rangers, Rogers Rangers, people that had opted to fight for the British, and they fought the same way as the American irregulars did. And for various political reasons, the native North Americans almost invariably fought for the British. One of the big grievances of the colonists was the fact that the British were honoring treaties that they had signed with the Native Americans, prohibiting white settlement in the Ohio Valley. And that was one of the biggest grievances of the colonists. They wanted that land. They wanted to kick the Indians off it and take their land. So why on earth would the natives have fought for the American colonists? They fought for the British. And the Indians, the Native Americans, were the absolute and acknowledged masters of guerrilla, open order, irregular warfare, not the colonists. Now, that's just my take on a historical myth. See that as you will. But another thing that I like to point out is the other side of the story. What exactly have guns in the hands of private citizens, at least from a political perspective, given us? Well, let's look at, say, the 20th century. Right after the First World War, due to the sudden cessation of hostilities, Europe was pretty much awash with surplus war materiel. Plenty of Germans went back to Germany with rifles. You could buy a rifle for 2 Reichsmarks, I think, or something like that. There were just so many of them around. So next thing you know, there's a big communist uprising, and the communists were on the point of actually taking over in Germany when they were suppressed by another group of political extremists who eventually morphed into the Nazis, and they were put down by force of arms. In other words, the communists, who at the time were armed private citizens, attempted to take control of the state, and they were only put down by another set of armed private citizens, the Freikorps, or the Stahlhelm, or the Cap Brigade, or whatever you want to call them. They were extreme right-wingers who eventually set up the Third Reich. So that didn't exactly lead to democracy. The Russian Revolution was carried out by the Red Guard, the Bolsheviks. They were not representative of any state prior to seizing power. They were just armed private citizens who booted out the Tsar, and they established, well, we all know what they established, Stalin and the Gulag. The French were booted out of Indochina by the Viet Minh, another communist guerrilla movement. They were armed private citizens as well until they took control of the North Vietnamese government. And then after that, the Viet Cong in the south, the communist guerrillas in South Vietnam, were also just armed private citizens, and they were active in South Vietnam throughout the Vietnam War. Now, none of these groups, the Freikorps, the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, you can throw in plenty of other ones, like, say, the Taliban, the Mujahideen of various political affiliations in Afghanistan. One could mention the Khmer Rouge, any number of third world guerrilla movements, say Fidel Castro's guerrillas who kicked out Batista in Cuba, Marxists as well, and any successful guerrilla movement in the 20th century was invariably totalitarian. You simply have to have a totalitarian organization in order to effectively fight a guerrilla war. You have widely dispersed soldiers who are in limited contact with each other, deliberately obscure, deliberately difficult to track down. You have to keep them under very, very tight control for them to be effective at all. And that lends itself only to an iron discipline, which a totalitarian ideology is best able to provide. Democratic guerrillas, it's kind of an oxymoron. You can't really fight a guerrilla war on a democratic basis. It simply hasn't been done. So armed private citizens, if you ask me, tend to be extremist anti-state types or anti-present state types that boot out governments. Oftentimes they certainly don't boot out good governments. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done anything at all. But they invariably, because of the type of fighting that guerrilla fighters have to engage in as armed private citizens, they end up as totalitarians, and they establish governments that are, if anything, more thoroughgoing in their totalitarianism than the governments that they have kicked out. Whatever you think about Castro, he's proved to be a much more thorough and durable and totalitarian ruler of Cuba than Batista was. The same thing goes for the communists and the Nazis, the fascists. Oh yes, I forgot to mention Mussolini. He was also put in power by an armed private army. And there's also the phenomenon of warlordism, which is very synonymous with the armed private citizen. The narco cartels in Latin America, the narco warlords in the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. One could even throw in Al Capone and his merry men in Chicago in the 1930s. These were just armed private citizens, but they certainly were not champions of human freedom. So I do not believe that armed private citizens have anything at all to do with human freedom. In fact, the historical record would seem to indicate exactly the opposite. And again, I'm not advocating any political point of view. I'm not advocating the repeal of the Second Amendment. First of all, I'm a Canadian, so it's none of my business what the U.S. Constitution reads as. And I'm not advocating tougher gun control laws. I'm not advocating anything of that sort. I'm simply stating that one of the philosophical underpinnings of the gun culture, I suppose, and I mean that, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way. The people that believe that guns are a guarantor of human freedom, I don't believe that is a justified position. And again, I simply would say that the historical record would say actually the opposite. armed private citizens are more likely to institute a dictatorship or even a nasty totalitarian, possibly genocidal dictatorship than they are to make people free. That's not how people become free. People become free by organizing, by demonstrating, by fighting every single day in their masses to throw out a dictatorship. That's how the communist regimes of Eastern Europe fell. That's how Ferdinand Marcos fell. That's how any number of dictators have been toppled. People simply started to refuse to do as the dictators said. You reach for your gun and you get, at best, another dictatorship. At worst, you get a civil war or a completely rapacious regime. Thank you.